Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the next in our series of well-tempered music, keys, tonality, and their emotional and expressive import, or whatever I call this series. I never remember. It's too long. But here's the thing. Once I scratch my nose, we are going to talk about D major. And some of you who have been following the series will know that it's been a bit of a while since our last one, and when we did C sharp or D flat and those things, because D major, I was thinking to myself, oh, this is going to be so difficult, simply because D major is probably the most common key in all of music, even more so than C major in some respects, particularly in instrumental music. And there's a good reason for that, which we're going to go into. But when something is this well known and this common, it's very hard to identify any kind of specific expressive or emotional state it may represent, because everyone uses it all the time for everything. And that's what happened with D major. I mean, think about it. You've got, I don't know, 30 or 40 Haydn symphonies are in D major. It's very, very, very popular. The classical period, Beethoven second, the Missus Solemnis, and then you've got Brahms second and Dvorak sixth. And I just so many pieces, way, way too many to mention. It is also the key of most of the most famous violin concertos. I mean, the three big ones in the Romantic period, that is Beethoven, Brahms, and Tchaikovsky. They're all in D major. And why is that? And there are lots of other violin concertos in D major too. There's Stravinsky, and there's Korngold, and there's a couple by Mozart. The reason is this. The violin, that workhorse of the orchestra, is arranged around the key of D. And, if you know anything about violins, you know they have four strings, right? And those strings are tuned a fifth apart from each other. From the bottom up, they go G, D, A, and E. So D is number 2. And being number 2 gives it a rather unique situation, privileged situation in the violin universe, because the G string is a G. You can't go lower than that bottom G, but D has wonderful, wonderful relationships with the other strings, because the dominant, that is the key of fifth above the D, is the A, and the key of fifth below is the G. So you've got the dominant and what they call the subdominant. Now, why do we care about that? The reason we care about that is because the violin is capable of making certain natural overtone and resonance amongst all the strings when you play them. And the most resonant strings on the violin are open strings. Open strings are strings where, how violinists play like on the fingerboard with their fingers pressing down, just like guitarists press down on the frets on the guitar. They hold it, they go like this to stop. It's called stopping the string. And when you stop the string, you make it shorter. And when you make it shorter, you make the pitch higher, and you get different notes. If you don't do anything to the string and just leave it alone, it's an open string. It's free to vibrate. And some of the notes that the D string really, really wants to vibrate on are its dominant, the fifth higher, the A, and the subdominant, the G, a fifth lower. So the D string has a particular sympathetic vibration with the other strings on the violin. Now, do you hear this? Not really consciously. These are very, very subtle effects. But they're magnified, for example, in orchestral situations. And beyond that, it does give the key of D major a special resonance and brilliance when you're playing scales up and down the G string, even though you're stopping notes there. If you play just an open D, then the rest of your strings on the violin are very happy. At least that's the way the argument goes. I actually think that even more significant than the argument about the overtone series and the technical, physical, acoustical issues is simply the fact that the key of D is easy to play on the violin. That is, the fingerings of the D major scale. I mean, I only played a little viola. I didn't play violin, but the fingering on the D major scale it's the easiest scale there is, probably, on the violin. Probably. And violinists traditionally back in the day when all of these things were starting to happen, most of them were not terribly well trained. Everybody, learned to play an instrument because you had no choice. If you wanted to hear music, you had to play music. And most violinists weren't very good. But one thing they could probably all do was play in D major. And so a tremendous amount of music, especially orchestral music, was written in the key of D major. And there is even more beyond that. First of all, this explains why so many violin concertos are written in D major. You can be as virtuosic as you want, but it's going to make your violin sound really good. Most of the time. That's the theory. But the technical aspect of the ease with which violins played in D major extends well beyond violins. Because if you're going to be playing in D major on your strings most of the time, everyone else has to follow along. And this is particularly true of brass players, of trumpets and timpani. Timpani, you could only tune them to two notes anyway in those days. You usually had two drums and you tuned them to tonic and dominant. That is a key, and the complementary key that was 1/5 above. So if you're in D major, you would tune your other drum in A. Actually, it was the opposite. The lower drum would be in A and the higher drum would be in D, your tonic key. And so you'd have those two basic notes of D major harmony. But trumpets were a big problem. Because if you wanted trumpets and drums in your symphony, or in whatever you were doing in those days, you had to requisition them from the army. Trumpeters were mostly military players or night watchmen or something like that. They had one volume, which was loud, and they could only play in a couple of keys. And trumpets in those days, because they had no valves, were extremely limited in what notes they could play. So the most usable notes in a scale would be way up high in the instrument's range, the upper partials, as they were called in the day and still are. Because if you start with, like a D, then you cut it in half, you get the D an octave higher, then you cut it in thirds, you cut it in smaller bits, you start getting fifths and thirds and other intervals and things like that. And the shorter it gets, the closer those intervals become. I mean, that's it in a nutshell. And I'm going to beg all of you, string players and trumpeters, do not add anything to this conversation. This is not a scientific conversation. This is an anecdotal, historical conversation. Nobody cares about the details of instrument construction specifically, just about the fact that it was very, very unlikely that you would have lots of instrumentalists lining up to play your piece if it was in a bizarre key, because the instrument simply didn't function in that key. So D major became the key par excellence of triumphant martial music for trumpets and drums and orchestra. And, so when you add to these two factors, you have the brilliance of the strings, that wonderful combination of warmth and resonance, and then the military aspect, the idea of having trumpets and drums in D major. Think of Beethoven's Second Symphony, the second subject. Ba da da da, ba da dum bum 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 ba dum, boom boom ba da 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 da. It's like, that kind of thing. Although that's actually the second subject, so it's probably an A. Never mind. You get the point. The idea of having these instruments sounding at their best in this key and having players who could play in that key, that gave D major the prominence that it has today. I mean, Handel's Hallelujah Chorus is in D major. I already talked about the Missa Solemnis. Bach's B minor Mass is in D major. Why? Because B minor is the relative minor of D major. In other words, it has exactly the same scale that D major does. It's just if you start in a different place and go up from there, like the note B, you wind up in a minor key. It's the minor version of the D major scale, but it's the same notes. So putting the Mass in B minor is wonderful because the minor key chorus at the opening can be in B minor, but all of the other ones with trumpets and drums are in D major, just the relative major of B minor, the other way around. So it's really in D major. And so many pieces like that are all in D major. Zadok the Priest, Handel's glorious coronation anthem, that's in D major. So pomp, splendor, ceremonial music, all came to be written in D major. Now, does D major have any intrinsic qualities that allow it to us to associate it with those things, or did history just sort of shuffle it into that slot and have it fulfill that role? I think it's the latter, clearly. I think it's a question of we associate D major with certain emotional states or works because history has given D major that role for a bunch of technical reasons and some physical reasons as well in the construction of stringed instruments. That's how it happens. And since D major is such a common key and not one of the more unusual or extraordinary ones, it doesn't really have an opportunity to acquire a very specific and very odd, or shall we say off the beaten path, expressive identity. It's a really good workhorse key. Now, the next question that I want to address is there any way to hear that? Aside from listening to the Hallelujah Chorus and Zadok the Priest and the B minor Mass, the answer is I think there is. I really think there is. I have sort of come up with a test that I'm going to run for you to listen and see what you think. The test is actually Bach's Magnificat. And this is very, very interesting. Bach's Magnificat, the one we know and love, is in D major. Not surprisingly, because it has lots of zesty writing for trumpets and drums. However, Bach originally wrote that Magnificat in E flat major with some additional movements and some other things. The D major version was revised for a later performance, and it's not surprising he revised it into D major if he wanted it to be played more frequently and maybe wanted to give it an extra brilliancy of sound. That's the question. The question is the sound. Fortunately for us, that E flat major version has been recorded, and so has the D major version. Both of them were recorded by Helmut Rilling with his Stuttgart Bach Academy Forces as part of their complete Bach edition. So I am going to play you the opening chorus of the Bach Magnificat in E flat and in D. And you can compare them. You can see if one sounds somehow fuller, more something. I'm not even going to put words in your mouth. Just listen and see what the difference is and see if you can tell them apart in any descriptive or emotional or expressive kind of way. I think this is absolutely fascinating. I have my own opinion. But the thing to keep in mind that makes it very interesting for me is that E flat is a half a step higher than D. So it's worth considering. Does E flat sound brighter and more brilliant than D if it's higher, or does it not? That's kind of the question I think we need to answer. So let's begin with the original E flat version of the opening chorus, the first minute and a half or so of the Magnificat with Helmut Rilling from the Haenssler Complete Bach edition. So here is Magnificat in E flat. And here is exactly the same music in D. So, which one sounded not better, sounded more something to you? I mean, this is my personal opinion. I think that the D major version is somehow a little bit more brilliant and fulsome than the E flat version. And what makes it so interesting to me is that the E flat version, although it's a half a step higher than D, actually sounds, I think, a bit more subdued, a little lower somehow, and less gleaming on top. Now, you may disagree with that. It's all a very, very subjective thing. But it's marvelous that we can make this comparison in a genuine masterpiece that a lot of people already know. And so you can hear the difference clearly. Now, Bach did not, he didn't literally just say, okay, take the E flat one and play it in D. He rewrote it. So he changed some things around a little bit, but even that's significant because he obviously knew that he was writing for different forces and he wanted them to sound as wonderful as they possibly could in the key of D. And Bach is another wonderful example to choose because there's a lot of evidence that Bach really didn't care what anybody could do in any key. He wrote for everything the same way all the time anyway. So although he may have made some concessions to being in E flat versus in D, they were very minimal. He just expected his players to be able to play whatever he wrote, period. And whether they could or they couldn't, in those days, if you couldn't, you just didn't. They would just stop or they'd play a few notes and give up the rest. Nowadays, we expect our performers to be able to do it exactly the way he wrote it. And so we have a wonderful opportunity to compare one to the other. And that, my friends, is the story of D major. I don't think there's really any point in going a lot further and playing lots more D major because there's just so much of it. And, we're not going to learn anything additional. But I think these Bach comparisons are extremely interesting and meaningful. And remember, these differences that we talk about, they're subtle. They're subtle. It's not ridiculous, obvious stuff. It's very, very technical in some respects. And I think really, like I said, totally subjective depending on the listener and your own sense of pitch and your own sense of feeling when you hear the music. But I think there's something in that. I think there's something in these two Magnificat things that tells us something about why D major became the incredibly popular key that it has remained ever since. So keep on listening, friends. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.